Are you sure this thing is safe?
When I was a kid, I was obsessed with everything Star Wars. Also Thunderbirds and things like that, but Star Wars was the thing that I loved most. I don't remember seeing Star Wars for the first time. It's like it has always been there, a constant in my life. They weren't so much films, but just an entity that could be depended on. I had the films, soon the toys and bed sheets, then the video games and so on. It was this distant galaxy, another universe to lose yourself in, so far from what I had by the seaside. I feel like I've always wanted to be a filmmaker and always loved films, and I feel like Star Wars played into that like it did for so many others. But the truth is I can pinpoint the exact moment I understood I loved films rather than just Star Wars, and that making them felt like an actual, possible dream. Like something I could do for a job, something I wanted to do. Cameras suddenly went from being a fun thing to play with to something to practice with. My dad would often show us films that he felt we would enjoy, but was very careful to ensure they were at least somewhat age appropriate. Back then, pre every home having the internet, it was pretty easy to shield kids from anything you felt they shouldn't see, at least in films and TV. Sex, violence, swearing, it was all kept pretty far from our eyes. In some ways, Star Wars was one of the most graphic things I'd seen, save for video games, which for some reason were not treated in the same way. Perhaps simply due to the lack of detail and the corny fake feeling of games like Mortal Kombat and Resident Evil. Any films that my dad knew I'd find cool but definitely wasn't old enough to see, he'd instead describe to me in a theatrical storytime manner. I have great memories of him telling me the plot of Richard Donner's The Omen, especially with the concept of the mark in the victims' pictures matching their deaths, and the shung sound he'd use to describe the priest being impaled. I was desperate to see one of these so beautifully described films, but for most of my early childhood they were kept far away. If there was a film on late that he did want us to see but was past our bedtime, it would of course be recorded for consumption later. One such film playing around midnight on perhaps Channel 4 or 5 when I was 8 years old was Don Siegel's 1956 sci-fi classic, Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Like much of the 50s American sci-fi, it is a subversive tale, playing on the fears of the time, of Cold War paranoia and the dangers of McCarthyism. Much of this would of course go over my head, and instead I simply enjoyed the dark suburban horror, one that was muted and tame enough for me and my 6-year-old sister to enjoy. Left to watch it alone one weekend afternoon whilst my dad was out and my mum was doing stuff elsewhere around the house, I remember we were gripped by the film. It was easy to understand. Humans are being replaced by an alien force with emotionless clones, so as to gradually take over the world. I loved its age-appropriate chills. And when it ended, that's when the tape informed us what would be playing next, as it had been left recording the following feature. Night of the Living Dead. Now there was a title. What impressionable kid always kept from seeing those films behind such incredible looking VHS covers with that wonderful dark red 18 label, marking them as forbidden treasures only for adults, wouldn't immediately understand that what was coming would be special? This was what I'd been waiting for. It was a dim day outside, grey and ugly, so we were locked in anyway. Our parents weren't around, and though my little sister knew watching this film certainly was not allowed, she looked up to me as her older brother and would follow me gladly. Like the previous film, it was black and white, never an issue for us as children, and yet had a different tone to anything we'd seen before. It was grim. We had graveyards like this near us. They were never fun places to be. This was more like the kind of place we had seen growing up, yet we had no idea these sort of films really existed. Soon, things took a turn. I'd seen monsters before, and the pod people of Invasion of the Body Snatchers was certainly quite scary to a then pretty sheltered 8-year-old, but these beasts were different. They looked like us. They sounded sort of like us, like the pod people, and yet they weren't there to mildly annoy townspeople or to commit unseen horrors off-screen. Blood poured from wounds, flesh was eaten, a young couple burnt alive, a sister killed by her brother, a child, one barely older than us, eating her father before stabbing her mother to death. We were glued to the screen, unable to turn away from seeing this hellish vision play out in front of our eyes. The one thing that really held any hope that the protagonist would at least get out, to warn others, to help others, to survive, he was gunned down. As we sat there dumbfounded by what we'd seen, watching the credits roll over images of the lead being pulled around on meat hooks, I think something small but that would become important changed within me. There was a new awareness, one that would grow more as I struggled to sleep over the next few days. As the fear finally began to subdue, it wasn't an awareness of how horrible the world could be that remained, or an awareness of why my parents had protected me from this sort of film, although that was quite clear, but instead of the power of films themselves. This film had shown us horrors we didn't even know existed. It made my sister weep. It gave me nightmares. I wanted to know how. I was in a lot of trouble for sitting through the film and letting my little sister watch it, though the following trauma was considered punishment enough. And soon enough, I was asking questions about it. Who made it? Why would they make it? Films aren't just about entertainment, they're about feeling, about introducing new worlds or familiar ones seen in new ways. They're about immersing yourself in someone else's mind, about fully submitting to their imagination. Night of the Living Dead for me showed me somewhere that reminded me of where I lived, of the small place I grew up in, and how a person could use that to make something completely new. Here a nightmare, but in being so close to my own experience, with that fear of graveyards, of strangers in a small town, I was suddenly aware of the person behind the camera. Someone made this. They must have come from a similar background, and yet they made a movie. People like me could make movies, and those movies meant something. I realized someone out there at some point made Star Wars. It wasn't always something that existed. It was a light bulb moment. These things are important, and why couldn't I do it? Suddenly I was watching any film I could, and reading whatever I could about the filmmakers, learning about Romero and then Spielberg and Lucas, the guys I realized were responsible for so much of my childhood, and with age onto Rodriguez, Scorsese, Fincher, Chan-wook, I was digesting everything I could, to behind-the-scenes extras and documentaries, to making my own films. I even got around to sort of making my own zombie film. Now, I love movies more than anything else really. I work on films, I make videos about films, and really I can put it all back to that one special experience. Back when films were still exciting and sometimes dangerous. I worry sometimes that we've lost something with how easy it is to find films nowadays. But then I'm 26 now. I'm very different to that 8-year-old watching a horror film with a restricted rating. So really I don't know now what affects someone like that. What can turn those lights on in their eyes and truly shock and inspire them. I guess if there is something to learn from this, it's that we forget sometimes that there are people out there, young or old, that can still fall in love with movies. I expect most who watch my videos already have to some extent, but if you're making them, or even just showing them to someone, maybe think what they can do for that person. A great film can be a transformative experience, and the experience watching it can be as important as the film itself. Would seeing Night of the Living Dead at 15 without a little sister there reacting to every terrifying sequence beside me have had the same effect? Perhaps not. The same way that sitting with my dad in the cinema to see Fellowship of the Ring for the first time back around New Year 2001 probably held so much more power for me than if I'd waited to see it at home. Showing a beloved, important film to someone, to a friend or a child, that one act of introducing them to something special could, who knows, lead to another important film being made one day. One that goes on to inspire generations to come. After all, where do you think Star Wars came from?